Donald Trump has finally made up his mind. The United States of America is introducing a new package of sanctions against entities within the Russian Ministry of Defense. And Syria, formerly Moscow's closest ally in the Middle East, has agreed to drastically reduce imports of Russian oil in exchange for the lifting of the latest American sanctions against Syria itself. Both decisions hit the same spot: the money that Russia receives for the war, just from different sides. One directly restricts the military structures of the Russian Federation, and the other cuts the already plummeting revenues from the sale of Russian oil. To put it briefly, this is probably the first serious blow from the United States in the past year. And finally, Washington has once again started imposing sanctions against the Russian Federation. In this episode, we'll take a detailed look at both events, the direct sanctions and cutting Syria off from oil. My name is Alexei Pechi. Let's discuss this topic together. But before we begin, please subscribe to this YouTube channel, like the episode, and be sure to leave any comment on this video. So let's start with the latest news about new US sanctions against Russia. The United States Department of State has published a notice in the Federal Register which tells us that the sanctions against the Russian Ministry of Defense formally came into effect back on July 24, but this was not officially announced right away. The US State Department document directly states the reason, and here is a quote. On July 24, 2026, the US government took measures provided for in Section 3 of the Weapons of Mass Destruction Non-Proliferation Act with respect to Iran, North Korea, and Syria. So, the formal reason is not actually Russia's war against Ukraine, but the accusation of assisting and spreading weapons of mass destruction applied to 3 countries at once: Iran, North Korea, and Syria. It's important to understand how slow the US apparatus is, but also how consistent it is. So, regarding Ukraine, you need to understand that for the war against Ukraine, sanctions against Russia will keep coming for several more years, even after the war is over. Let's put it this way. In Syria, there's already been a new government for almost 2 years. Bashar Assad's regime collapsed a long time ago, but the sanctions are still catching up. Who is now subject to the restrictions? And here the list is quite detailed. Sanctions have been imposed against 2 departments of the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation, specifically the Main Missile and Artillery Directorate and the Directorate for Advanced Inter-Service Research and Special Projects, as well as against the Russian ground forces as a whole and the 1061st Logistics Support Center. Well, and for Ukraine, this is certainly a good sign, since the US will regulate any supplies for the Russian military even more strictly, and not only directly but also through third countries. In addition to military structures, 2 companies were included in the list: Gideon Alpha and International Invest Company, including their subsidiaries and any successors. And in addition, the sanctions affected 5 specific individuals: Andrei Gusev, Andrei Kosolapov, Vladislav Morozik, Alexander Prikodko, and Sergei Tsybarev. What does all this mean? In practice, the imposed sanctions in particular prohibit US federal agencies from purchasing goods, technologies, or services from the individuals and organizations included in the list. In addition, American entities are prohibited from providing any support to these individuals and organizations, selling military-related products, or issuing the corresponding licenses. And these sanctions have been imposed for 2 years with the possibility of extension. Here's an important detail for understanding the context. This is not the first batch of such restrictions, and clearly not the last. At the same time as the news about sanctions against the Russian Ministry of Defense is being published, another broader sanctions bill against Russia is being discussed in the US. The very one that the Democrats criticized as a pretext to give Donald Trump broad powers to impose tariffs against any countries helping Moscow to circumvent restrictions. This is the very same Hell Sanctions bill by Lindsey Graham. So, targeted sanctions against specific military departments are happening in parallel with work on a much broader package, which no longer directly affects the structures of the Russian army, but rather those who buy oil and gas from Russia. Now, the second part of today's topic, and it directly concerns money for the war. Syria, according to Reuters, has agreed to sharply reduce imports of Russian oil as part of ongoing negotiations with the United States to lift the latest major sanctions against Syria itself. Well, let's break down why this is actually important news and where the irony lies, and how this is even related to the sanctions against Russia itself. In fact, these are two very interconnected stories. Damascus has been under serious American sanctions for many years, imposed back during the previous regime of Bashar al-Assad, and some of these sanctions are still in place today, even despite the change of power in Syria and its political shift toward the West. Well, there's a reason I said that the US bureaucracy is quite slow, but still consistent. At the same time, Syria has become heavily dependent specifically on Russian oil, despite its own pro-Western course. Moreover, hoping to keep its military bases in Syria even under the new government, Russia significantly increased supplies of cheap oil to Syria after the fall of Bashar Assad's regime. So Syria, which is now friendly with Washington, for years continued to buy oil from Moscow simply because there were no alternatives, or they were much more expensive. And Moscow, as an absolutely unscrupulous entity, even after the fall of its own puppet regime of Bashar Assad, only increased oil supplies to Syria. Like, okay, you overthrew Bashar Assad, well, no big deal, we'll keep supplying you with oil. And now Damascus is putting the question to the West. Lift the remaining sanctions from us, and we will sharply reduce our purchases of Russian oil, even to the point of refusing it altogether. And here I should note that Syria depends on Russian oil not of its own choosing, but out of necessity. And Syrian officials are asking for the sanctions to be lifted first so that the Syrian Republic can find alternatives. Because now, due to the fact that the sanctions are still in place, no one else wants to work with Syria. They say, well, it's a sanctioned country and it's better not to get involved. So, the logic of Damascus is as follows. Lift the restrictions, and we will have the opportunity to find other suppliers, and then we can easily do without Moscow altogether. It's not really that interesting to us anyway. And now, a Syrian representative of the energy sector directly stated that Damascus is already looking for new suppliers and announced, in his words, radical changes in the country's energy policy. And what's interesting here is that if the US lifts the sanctions, and they most likely will, this will really mean a break in ties with Moscow. Because many people wondered why Syria, for example, still keeps Russian military bases on its territory. And here the situation seems very complicated, although in reality it's actually very simple. And as long as Syria is dependent on Iranian Russian oil, it cannot deny Russia permission to keep military bases there, because if it does, Russia will immediately cut off all oil supplies. Russia understands this too and realizes that if Syria finds an alternative, it will most likely be asked to leave the country and Moscow will have to remove all its military bases. So it's a kind of connection where if the US lifts sanctions and Syria finds an alternative, and it will find one easily, then Russia not only loses the oil export market, but also actually loses its military bases in that country. Now let's talk about what lies behind Syria's sanctions status. This is also an important part of the context. The United States Department of State designates those countries as state sponsors of terrorism, which, according to the agency, provides support to terrorist organizations. And Syria has been in this status for many years under the previous government, and the lifting of the remaining restrictions is part of a broader process of integrating the new Syrian authorities into the international system after the regime change. Now let's combine these two stories, because they are two sides of the same coin, and let's also figure out what this sanctions hit on Russia is all about. Look at this connection. On one hand, the US is directly restricting specific units within the Russian Ministry of Defense, departments responsible for missile and artillery supplies and advanced military developments. In other words, they're targeting the Russian army's ability to purchase technologies and components through third countries. I think for Ukrainians, unfortunately, this won't be news, but Western components are still being found in Russian missiles. This is a blow specifically to that capability. On the other hand, Washington is simultaneously taking away another major oil buyer from Russia. Moreover, it's a longtime military and political ally of Moscow in the Middle East, through whom significant volumes of supplies were delivered. And here it's worth adding, as they say, some recent context that makes this news even more sensitive for the Kremlin. Oil refining within Russia itself has already dropped to its lowest level in more than 20 years. According to Bloomberg's estimates, in July, oil refining amounted to only 3.6 million barrels per day. That's, mind you, the lowest since May 2002. Which means almost for the entire quarter of a century and the whole period of Vladimir Putin's rule. On my Telegram channel, Peachy News, the link is in the description of this video, I actually posted an interesting chart yesterday that clearly shows this drop in oil refining, and it's really drastic. For comparison, during the period from 2020 to 2025, Russian oil refineries processed on average more than 5.5 million barrels per day at this same time of year. So the current figure is about a third lower than the seasonal norm. The reason is a record series of strikes. Ukrainian drones have been targeting oil facilities. In particular, just last month, 18 plants were attacked, including the largest ones in Russia. This is the Omsk oil refinery, which is located more than 2,500 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. Now let's put it all together. Russian oil refining has already been crippled by strikes deep inside the territory, even without any sanctions. Now, on top of that comes the loss of yet another buyer, Syria. Syria, which will sharply cut its purchases and most likely will eventually ask the Russians to leave the country and take their military bases with them. By the way, Georgia is also gradually refusing Russian oil. And at the same time, a new package of American sanctions against specific military structures responsible for supplying the army. So the blow is coming from three directions at once. Against the production of petroleum products inside Russia itself, against their sales channels abroad, and against the military departments that then spend those resources on the war. What does this mean for what happens next? Sanctions against specific departments of the Ministry of Defense by themselves, to be honest, are a relatively targeted measure that is unlikely to immediately paralyze the Russian army. Such lists of individuals and organizations are updated regularly, and Moscow has long since built mechanisms to bypass them through intermediary structures and third countries. In other words, this process is already well established. Moscow knows how to circumvent sanctions. Therefore, the much more significant long-term effect will be the loss of the Syrian oil market. If Damascus really does sharply reduce its purchases, this will tighten the noose even further around Russia's already collapsed oil refining industry. It is also worth noting what will happen to Syria itself if the sanctions are lifted from it. This could set a precedent for the further reorientation of the entire Middle Eastern energy policy of the new Syrian authorities towards Western and Arab suppliers rather than Russian ones. Considering that Russia has used its military presence in Syria for years as a lever of influence in the Middle East, the loss of even part of this influence through the oil channel is not just a financial blow. I would even say it's not so much about the money, because now attentive viewers will say, well, okay, the volumes aren't that huge, and it's Syria that's buying the oil. But the point is, this is a blow to Moscow's geopolitical positions in the region as a whole. Russia, let's be honest, is being completely pushed out of the Middle East and Central Asia, where it used to wield enormous influence. Now it's being thrown out of there completely. And many people can also see this as a perfect example of how a country that broke free from the influence of unwashed Russia suddenly started to thrive. Syria could become a showcase like that. In conclusion, on August 4th, two decisions came together at once, hitting different parts of the Russian military and economic machine. These are targeted sanctions on defense ministry entities responsible for supplying the army, and the decision of a former Middle Eastern ally to sharply reduce purchases of Russian oil in exchange for its own reintegration into the international system. In general, even if it's in small steps, the United States of America is taking action, and I already like this more. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments under this episode. Be sure to subscribe to this YouTube channel, and if you haven't done it yet, give it a like, subscribe to the channel and click the bell. If you want to support the work of this YouTube channel, you can do so with any donation using the links and details in the description of this video, or by becoming a sponsor on YouTube. I would be very grateful for that. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.